everybody. I'm Jacob Moe, Principal Investigator for the Archipelago Network, which is a cultural heritage and research NGO based in Greece.
And I am Marina Markellou. I'm an Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Law in Groningen, the Netherlands.
And I'm Rachovitsa, an Associate Professor in Human Rights Law at the University of Nottingham in the UK.
So today we are happy to present some of our ongoing research in the context of a project called Trans-Mediterranean Archives Dialogue, which is led by the Archipelago Network, the NGO which I run in Greece, and focuses on strategies for open access and reuse amongst 3 archives, one of them being the Archipelago Network, based in Syros, Greece. The other one, UMAM Documentation and Research, which is based in Beirut in Lebanon. And the third, Cimatheque Film Center, which is based in Cairo in Egypt. It's a association, a coalition of these 3 archives, primarily because each of our archives have very different approaches and methodologies and kind of mandates for our archival practice, while also as being part of this region of the South Mediterranean and MENA region, we face overlapping cultural and social obstacles and issues, as well as legal ones, which we wanted to investigate together. As we're speaking, you'll see a couple slides with archival material from our 3 organizations, which formed parts of the case studies, which we are working on and will eventually be presented as well as a paper in addition to the research today. So in terms of giving you a brief overview of the kinds of collections we're working with, I'll start with the Archipelago Network, which in the context of its 2021-2022 activities, we produced a research project on traditional boat building on the island of Syros in the Cyclades, digitizing several private collections of material, namely from boatyards, traditional boatyards that included photographs as well as films and many sketches, naval architectural designs, things like that. And we'll speak a bit about the challenges that those presented in a moment. In Cimatheque, the case study we're focusing on is the Rafla collection, which is this incredible collection of mostly audiovisual material films from a private collection of a jeweler who was active in Cairo from the 1930s until the 1980s, and obsessively was collecting various forms of film. So small gauge, 8mm, 16mm, a lot of amateur film production, as well as newsreels. So in a way, the collection is a film collection which traces the history of the contemporary history of audiovisual production in Egypt in around the 20th century. And in the case of UMAM, they've been in Beirut, they've been focusing for the past several years on salvaging aspects of Studio Baalbek, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with, but it was for almost 4 or 5 decades the most important film production company in the Middle East, based in Beirut, and it went bankrupt and then closed, after which its assets were basically both thrown away and distributed in various forms. And UMAM Documentation Research, as an archival organization, went in and salvaged most of the film outtakes, so not the actual films, but a lot of the kind of B-roll and thrown away material, as well as the paper archive and some of the sound archive. So that's the kind of content that we are working with and using as the basis for some of our legal case studies.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. So I'm trying to focus on these 3 organizations and explicitly to these 3 case studies from a copyright perspective. So we have observed that both 3 organizations share the same passion for fulfilling the main fields of archival activity, such as that is digital preservation, reuse, and the management and the digital accessibility of the material. But we can see it's obvious due to the fact of the specificities of the archives and the archival material, it's really, for example, we have many political concerns, or we have really the impossibility of finding the stakeholders who have the copyrights on the material, etc. It's impossible to maintain and to keep an appropriate clearance rights procedure. So the fact is that we are trying to engage the three organizations in order to understand the international standards that exist from a copyright perspective, in order to be able to promote access in an open way. And we are trying to increase the awareness towards the Creative Commons initiatives and all the right statements initiatives that exist on an international level, so that they can really find a contractual way of making available their material to the public. And last, there is the issue of the reuse of this material. So there are so many legal issues from a copyright and cultural heritage perspective. So we try to create a policy that specifically answers to content reuse, such as what kind of open licenses are we going to use, what are the ethical or other legal challenges that exist, and what kind of acts of digital preservation of the archival e-collections will be supported. That's all.
Okay. Right. So my part of the presentation concerns how human rights law and human rights concerns are applicable to these case studies and these organizations. And now, while I was thinking yesterday quite intensively, what's the main point? One of the main points of this presentation is I decided the main point may be encapsulated in one word, and this is rubbish. Mm-hmm. Yes, I will explain myself. Yes. So, but why? Why rubbish? Because quite literally, many of these organizations, they actually find objects and collections in rubbish. So there's an amazing network of garbage collectors to track drivers that later on find their way into flea market vendors, and then to private collections, and quite rich ones, or to very specific unofficial archival institutions, right? Hence rubbish. And why rubbish? Because in many instances, this may come from people having these collections and they're just getting rid of them at some point, or it's actually state institutions that trying to get rid of their material, either for space concerns, a very typical scenario around the world, right? But also the very common scenario of the state trying to get rid of material that they don't want it to be collected, they don't want it to be preserved, because this type of material and collections may support narratives that they go against very mainstream narratives of national identity, for example. So this network and the positionality of finding these things in rubbish is very important to understand who these organizations are and what they're actually, what are these archives and collections. So a first observation would be that these people and these organizations, they're not formal archivists like the first presentation, the National Library in France. They're not trained professionals, right? And the institutions, they are, let's say, unofficial archival institutions, unofficial archives. They're not the formal memory institutions of archives, libraries, museums, and galleries. And these organizations and these people, they actually accidentally, most of the time, especially at the beginning, encounter these objects in rubbish or anywhere else. So they put themselves in a status of being in assuming an incidental care of these objects, of these collections. They take it in. Usually these organizations, many, well, 2 out of 3 for sure, they didn't initially start with the aim to become archives. This is something that they turned into in the course of what they were doing. But they take very seriously their aim somehow to guard this material. So it's a very characteristic phrase that they're using, some of them, like we are the guardians, and then trying to preserve basically archives that they're known in literature as counter archives or community archives. These may be very consciously political resistant community-based archives that they try to historize in different ways and disrupt mainstream national narratives. But they can also be archives that they don't necessarily position themselves as counter national narratives, but they're trying to do something in parallel, something different to national institutions and official archives. Now, for the record, especially for these case studies and these organizations, especially 2 out of 3, they in Lebanon and in Egypt, they work under very difficult circumstances of repressive regimes, or to say the least, unwelcome and hostile legislative and regulatory practices. To give an example, they cannot even call their archives archives because they will immediately attract issues of censorship. Right? So they call them different ways, like research and documentation organization. Now, what's human rights law has to do with all of this, right? Now, in terms of both accessibility and reuse of the material, human rights law comes to enable and support their work. So very quickly in the process of collecting something, preserving it, making it accessible one way or another, they themselves, these people in these organizations, they exercise the right of freedom of expression, right? But they also exercise the right to participate in cultural life, which is a very specific right under the International Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights. Besides themselves, the public and any other people engaging with them, from going to an event to watch a movie or online engaging with the archive, these people also are enabled in effectively exercising the right to access information and to seek information, and of course, in turn, themselves to participate in culture and in cultural life. The people being involved in these organizations, they are also can be seen as cultural defenders, which is a bit similar to human rights defenders. But in this case, they're specifically defending not only human rights, but also the protection of specific material that are of cultural value, and in certain instances, they can be also cultural heritage. But also archives themselves, they attract human rights protection. And they have, you can argue for the protection under the right of freedom of expression for the archive itself, and being part of, in certain instances, part of cultural heritage. Now, protection from whom? Protection from usually the repressive policies of the state. Now, one issue that has to do with accessibility and reuse with regard to human rights law, and may not enable necessarily their work, but it may inhibit their work, is issues of privacy and sensitivity concerns that they may pop up from within the archive. So, for example, privacy considerations or sensitivity considerations with regard to the one who donated the collection, right? Or privacy issues with regard to people who created something within the collection. For example, somebody wrote a letter to somebody else, and that letter is part of the collection. Or the so-called third parties, somebody wrote a letter and mentioned somebody else there, and this is the third party that their own privacy may be exposed. Now, this is a huge issue, both in formal archival practices and all the more in unofficial archival practices. What do you do with that? How do you screen it? How do you identify it? And when you have done that, how do you address it? Do you censor the archive? Do you make it accessible? Do you make it accessible with specific restrictions? There is some discussion right now. I mean, the official archival institutions have recognized the role of privacy there, but there are no policies or specific guidelines like how we address it. The working presumption in, I think, among archivists, official or unofficial ones, is that we give access and privacy comes somehow secondary. So there's a discussion there how you manage these competing interests. And I think, yeah, that's it for today. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Do you have any questions for me?
I would like to ask, you said that you try to raise awareness towards copywriting. In which way do you try to do this, or do you have it?
Within the project, because it's funded by Creative Europe, so it's a research project funded by the European Commission. We had already some workshops, so we have exchanged some ideas, and we have presented a little bit the national legislation, the copyright national legislation in Egypt, in Lebanon, and in Greece. And when we had this presentation of use cases, you know, in different kinds of studies, we tried to explain to them how in Greece we are using this international standard of open access, like Creative Commons and rights statement, so that they can use them in a certain way, depending.
Do they seem interested in?
Yeah, of course, because, you know, it's a way, a contractual way, a tool that they can really use so that they can avoid the lack of existing provisions within their national regulation. So there is an alternative tool that they can use properly in order to make available to the public their collection.
And also, how do you handle the photo images collections? If I'm not sure, but isn't it that if someone is depicted as the image, then the image, if you haven't taken his written consent, belongs to him. Like if I am the image, then in an ideal world, it will be me that
So we have addressed this challenge for a specific case for archipelagos. Maybe Jacob, you would like to describe how?
Yeah, I mean, there are different. Yeah, there's different competing rights. I mean, there's the, for example, say we've digitized a collection of material from a family of boat builders in Syros Island, and many of those photographs have images, faces of people inside them. And what we do is we sign like licensing copyright agreements that give us the right to use those images. But we're also very clear, we're developing a series of strategies that are focused more around like reuse, which once that image is out in the world, we're formulating something called like a takedown policy, which basically means that if somebody then sees their image and doesn't agree, even though they've agreed to license it with how it's used, then we have a process through which they can contact us, and then we take down the image.
So this is a way to.
If you found them at the rubbish, so then how will you handle it? But yes, then the person might come.
So this kind of statement, this approach as a tool is a way to hijack a little bit, to circumvent privacy issues. So the example with the photo, you have the copyright issues of the person who took the photo, right? And ideally, you have the permission to use it and to make it accessible and use it. But also you have the privacy issue of the person depicted in the photo, right? And the statement, the takedown policy basically circumvents the fact that you may not be able to find that person to ask for consent. It can be a little bit problematic, but it's the best you can do somehow to circumvent the privacy concerns of the people depicted in the photos.
There is a multi-layered approach, you know. We are having a risk assessment. So you are going to evaluate every item within the collection so that you can really assess the risk and the need for making accessible to the public. So you have so many different kinds of parameters that you take into consideration. So then you go with this kind of policy. And
I think, just a comment, this is the best way, because my presentation is also about data. When we have sensitive data, the best way to don't violate the privacy of people is to anonymize them. But if you have photos, you can't do this. This kind of digital, yeah. I think this is the best way to overcome the problem.
And this is a kind of international practice that has been exercised, by major museums and GLAMs. So it's not, something that we invented.
Yes, and you found this material in rubbish, so it was available.
Even if we are going to find the materials in the hands of the collector, still the collector has not the right. He cannot really guarantee the privacy, but he can really give the authorization on behalf of the third person that is depicted within the picture or the image. So we still have the same problem, even if we are not going to find it, in the garden.
Yes, but the benefits are huge because you help so much to preserve all this material and give access to other people.
The problem is that when you have big collections, how do you do this item per item? It's a huge task, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
And then you said that some people don't want to preserve their cultural identity, so they throw them away rubbish or.
That's the key word today, huh?
Is it because of the restrictions or why would you don't want to maintain your cultural, not maintain, like keep it as a memory, even if it is not that.
They don't see it like that. Yeah, they don't see it.
Because to me it is important, of course, like this is. Like,
I think that's
it is important to keep it even if, because you remember, oh, this bad thing happened, or this could be as.
I think that's very personal. I consider myself a little bit of minimalist. So I have my memories, I write journals of why keep something that's not serving me,
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we are in this age of minimalist people trying to have less and less inside their homes. And the things that we don't use, they are the first one to go if we don't have an emotional attachment to them. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's great that you presented this, but thank you for your work.
Yeah,
Because
thank
you're
you.
doing something very noble, and you don't have to answer because it's a tricky question, but take regards to for the future publication to create a link between your presentation, your subject, and the subject of the conference.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
That's because I have something that I can link to social durability, but not that much with the digital humans.
All right.
So it's just a question of mine. And maybe it's gonna be something that they will ask you to do for the publication.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Some of their guides, they are completely material.
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the archive. In the cases of Cimatheque and UMAM, a lot of them are not yet digitized, but the infrastructure exists. It's more of a question of the team. Each of these organizations are basically 3 or 4 people volunteering their time.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.